The hospital at night was a different world. By day, it bustled with life, voices echoing through the halls, the steady hum of machines, and the rhythmic click of hurried footsteps. But when darkness cloaked the city, silence settled in like a suffocating fog. It was during these hours, the ones I spent on the night shift, that the hospital revealed its true face. My name is Claire, a seasoned nurse with years of experience, but nothing could have prepared me for the series of events that unfolded during one particularly grim November night. The shift began unremarkably. A few patients came in with minor emergencies, and the ICU remained calm. It was an eerie calm, the kind that seemed too good to be true. Around 2 a.m., the call light from room 309 flickered on. That room was supposed to be empty. I frowned, certain I had checked it earlier. Maybe someone had been admitted without my knowledge. I grabbed the chart from the nurse's station. It was blank. Hesitant but curious, I made my way down the dimly lit corridor, the sound of my squeaking shoes amplified in the stillness. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. "Hello," I called out softly. No response. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening. The bed was neatly made, untouched, but the air was wrong. Heavy, cold, and faintly metallic, like blood. I reached out to turn on the light, but before my fingers touched the switch, the door creaked and slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but sterile walls and empty corners. The room was vacant, yet the oppressive feeling of being watched was unbearable. Gathering my courage, I opened the door and left the room, glancing back to make sure it remained as still as I had found it. As I returned to the nurse's station, my colleague Maria gave me a puzzled look. "You okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a nervous laugh. I debated whether to tell her, but something about the way the air seemed heavier than usual kept me quiet. The rest of the shift crawled by. Then at 4 a.m., the call light for room 309 flickered again. This time it was accompanied by a faint, rhythmic beeping. My stomach twisted. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I couldn't let my imagination get the better of me. When I entered, the light from a heart monitor illuminated the room. The machine was on, its green lines pulsing steadily, but the bed was still empty. I checked the monitor's leads. They dangled uselessly, not connected to anything. Before I could process what was happening, a faint whisper brushed past my ear. "Help me." I froze. The voice was faint, barely audible, yet unmistakably pleading. My knees buckled as a chill raced down my spine. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, but when I turned, no one was there. Desperate for an explanation, I ripped the power cord from the monitor. The machine continued beeping. Panicked, I fled the room and bumped into Maria in the hallway. She looked pale, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "What?" I asked, though I feared I already knew. The crying. A woman, sobbing. It's coming from the ICU. Together we made our way to the ICU, our footsteps hesitant. The crying grew louder, more anguished as we approached. The sound led us to bed 12, a room that had been empty for weeks since its last occupant, Mrs. Reynolds, had passed away. Maria and I exchanged uneasy glances before stepping inside. The room was cold, colder than any room should be. On the bed lay an impression, as if someone invisible was pressing into the mattress. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence, and then the monitor beside the bed turned on, displaying a flat line. A scream erupted from the hallway, shattering the stillness. We bolted out of the room to find one of the junior nurses, Emily, trembling and pointing toward the stairwell. There was someone there," she stammered. "A woman in a hospital gown, but her face, it was all wrong." Maria stayed with Emily while I, against every instinct in my body, approached the stairwell. The air grew colder with each step. I peered down the stairs, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. A figure stood at the bottom, pale, skeletal, and clad in a blood-stained gown. Its head jerked unnaturally as it turned to face me. Empty eye sockets bored into mine, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. The figure took a step forward, then another, its bony feet scraping against the concrete stairs. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard. I turned and ran, my breath ragged as I burst into the hallway. "Call security!" I shouted to Maria, but before she could react, the lights in the corridor flickered and went out. Darkness engulfed us. The faint sound of dragging footsteps echoed closer. Panic surged as I grabbed Maria and Emily, pulling them toward the staff lounge where we barricaded the door. Inside, the room was suffocatingly quiet. The three of us huddled together, listening to the faint whispers and scratching coming from the other side of the door. Time stretched endlessly. When the noises finally stopped, it was almost dawn. Cautiously, we emerged. The hallway was empty, the air oddly still. We searched the hospital, but there was no sign of the figure or anything out of place. Room 309 was just as I had left it. The ICU was silent and the stairwell was deserted. When the day shift arrived, Maria and I recounted what had happened. The staff exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Later, an older nurse pulled me aside. "You're not the first to experience strange things here," she said. "Room 309, the ICU, the stairwell, they've all seen death too many times. Some say the ones who pass don't always leave." I never worked another night shift after that. The hospital by day was a sanctuary, but by night, it was a realm of the restless dead, where shadows danced and whispered secrets that no living soul should ever hear. And no matter how much time passes, I can still hear the faint beeping of that heart monitor and the whisper that begged for help.
Story number 2.
The quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the deserted hallways of St. Joseph's Hospital. It was 2:37 a.m., the dead of night, when the world outside slept and the hospital seemed to breathe on its own, alive with its quiet, unseen pulse. Nora adjusted her scrubs and tightened her ponytail, mentally preparing herself for another graveyard shift. She had been a nurse here for nearly 5 years, but the night shifts always felt different, darker, heavier. Tonight, her assignment was simple: monitor the patients on the 4th floor. It was the oldest wing of the hospital, notorious among staff for its eerie history. Whispers of strange occurrences often circulated during breaks. A shadowy figure seen in the corners of rooms, objects moving without explanation, and most chilling of all, the sound of a baby crying in the empty maternity ward. Nora didn't buy into the stories. She was a woman of science, grounded in reality, and believed every tale had a logical explanation. But as she pushed the service elevator button, the hairs on her arms stood up. It was colder than usual tonight. She blamed it on the malfunctioning HVAC system and dismissed the unease that slithered into her gut. The elevator doors groaned open, revealing the dimly lit corridor of the 4th floor. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with something older, something earthy and damp. Most of the rooms were empty, save for room 408, where an elderly man named Mr. Caldwell was recuperating from surgery. Nora walked to the nurse's station, checked Mr. Caldwell's chart, and noted his vitals. All stable. The rest of the floor was silent. She settled into the creaky swivel chair behind the desk and began charting, the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Minutes turned into hours. The monotony of paperwork began to lull her into a trance when a faint noise made her stop mid-type. It was coming from the end of the hallway, near the old storage room. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Nora froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like knuckles gently rapping against a hollow door. She swallowed hard, telling herself it was likely the building settling. The hospital was old, strange noises were common, but this sounded deliberate. Grabbing her flashlight, she decided to investigate. The beam cut through the darkness as she moved cautiously down the hallway. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and her pulse quickened with each step. The sound stopped as she reached the storage room. Nora stood there, staring at the heavy wooden door, the air around her growing colder by the second. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. She took a deep breath and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room cluttered with old medical equipment, gurneys with rusty wheels, and stacks of dusty files. The beam of her flashlight darted around the room, finding nothing unusual. She was about to leave when something caught her eye. A small figure huddled in the far corner. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. Nora stepped closer, her flashlight shaking in her hand. As she approached, she realized it was a child, a little girl no older than 7, dressed in a tattered hospital gown. Her hair was matted and her skin was deathly pale. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Are you lost?" Nora asked, kneeling to the girl's level. The child slowly lifted her head, revealing hollow, dark eyes that seemed to swallow the light. Nora's breath caught in her throat as a chill ran down her spine. Before she could react, the girl opened her mouth, emitting a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls. Nora stumbled back, dropping her flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. She scrambled to pick it up, but when the beam flicked back on, the girl was gone. Heart pounding, Nora backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. She sprinted back to the nurse's station, her mind racing. Was she hallucinating? Overtired? She tried to rationalize what she had seen, but deep down she knew it wasn't her imagination. As she sat down to steady herself, the call light for room 408 lit up. Nora nearly jumped out of her skin. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her clipboard and headed toward Mr. Caldwell's room. "Mr. Caldwell, is everything all right?" she asked, pushing the door open. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the monitors. The old man was sitting upright in his bed, staring blankly at the corner of the room. "Mr. Caldwell?" Nora repeated, stepping closer. His head turned slowly to face her, his eyes wide with terror. "She's here," he whispered, his voice raspy and strained. "The girl. She's standing right there." Nora's blood turned to ice. She whipped around, shining her flashlight into the corner, but it was empty. "There's no one here, Mr. Caldwell," she said, trying to sound calm, though her voice betrayed her. "She doesn't like you," he muttered, his gaze fixed on something over her shoulder. Nora felt a presence behind her, the air growing colder, heavier. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. Fighting the urge to run, she reassured Mr. Caldwell and left the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. Every creak, every flicker of the lights made her jump. When the morning staff arrived, she practically ran to the elevator, desperate to leave. As the elevator doors closed, she glanced back at the hallway one last time. Standing at the end, partially obscured by shadows, was the little girl. She lifted a hand and waved, her hollow eyes locking onto Nora's. The elevator descended, and the image burned itself into Nora's mind. She never worked the night shift again. But even years later, she would wake in a cold sweat, the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping echoing in her ears.
Story number 3.
The first thing you need to know about hospitals during the night shift is that they have a pulse of their own. It's not the hum of machines or the low murmur of nurses trading shifts. No, it's something darker, something alive. I learned this the hard way during one unforgettable night when I was assigned to the basement morgue. I'm Marcus, a radiology tech who occasionally gets pulled into duties beyond my scope, especially during the graveyard shift. That night, a body was due to be transported to the morgue, a John Doe who had come in through the ER but didn't make it. Transport was running behind, so my supervisor asked me to wheel the stretcher down myself. The hospital basement was a labyrinth of sterile hallways and cold fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to feel wrong. I wheeled the stretcher down with one hand, gripping my flashlight in the other. The morgue was at the far end, past the laundry room and some long-abandoned storage areas. As I approached the morgue doors, the air grew colder, not the ordinary chill of air conditioning, but a biting, unnatural cold. My breath misted in front of me. I chalked it up to nerves and pushed the stretcher through the double doors into the morgue's sterile stillness. The room smelled faintly of chemicals and something else, something metallic and decayed. I positioned the stretcher near the far wall where the storage drawers were, ready to transfer the body. But before I could move, the light above me flickered and buzzed. Then, it went out entirely. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, bouncing off the gleaming stainless steel drawers. The only sound was the faint hum of the cooling unit, but even that felt muted, as if the air itself were holding its breath. And then I heard it. A faint tapping. At first I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder. It was coming from one of the drawers. My stomach dropped. The tapping turned into a rhythmic thudding, deliberate and heavy, as if something or someone was trapped inside. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but morbid curiosity rooted me in place. Slowly, I approached the source of the noise. The drawer's label read John Doe, 12:15 a.m., the same body I had just brought down. My shaking hand reached out, gripping the handle. The metal was icy, almost painful to touch. With a deep breath, I pulled. The drawer slid out smoothly, revealing the body bag inside. It was sealed tight, motionless. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe I was just hearing the cooling system acting up. But as I reached to push the drawer back in, the bag moved. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the bag as it began to writhe. The faint sound of muffled screaming came from inside. My brain struggled to make sense of it. John Doe was dead, had been dead for hours. This couldn't be happening. The zipper of the body bag jerked, moving upward as if unseen hands were pulling it. Slowly, agonizingly, it opened to reveal the face of the John Doe. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly upward. Then they moved. "Help me," he croaked, his voice barely audible but filled with raw, gut-wrenching desperation. His lips moved again, but no sound came out. Instead, a low, guttural growl echoed through the room, vibrating in my chest. I scrambled for the flashlight, the light flickering as it landed on the figure. The man's chest heaved, but not with life. It was unnatural, erratic, as if his body was being puppeteered by something far worse than death. His head twisted toward me, bones cracking loudly. Those empty eyes locked onto mine, and a twisted grin spread across his face. The growling grew louder, morphing into an otherworldly scream that filled the morgue. My ears rang, and I clamped my hands over them, but it was no use. The noise was inside my head, clawing at my sanity. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the morgue or how I found myself back at the nurse's station, gasping for air. Maria, the night nurse, took one look at me and paled. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, still hearing faint echoes of that terrible scream in my ears. I managed to choke out a request for someone else to handle the morgue duties for the rest of the night. The next morning, I overheard the day shift staff talking about an incident in the basement. The cooling system in the morgue had malfunctioned, and the body of the John Doe had reportedly been found outside its drawer, the bag shredded as if something had clawed its way out. No one could explain it, and I sure as hell wasn't going to try. I transferred to the day shift the next week, unwilling to face the horrors that lurked in the hospital's shadows. But even now, I can't shake the memory of that night. The face in the body bag, the growl, the scream. And the worst part? Sometimes when I'm alone in the break room, I still hear faint tapping.
Story number 4.
Hospitals hold secrets. They cradle life at its most fragile and death at its most absolute. I've worked the night shift for 10 years as a respiratory therapist, and I thought I had seen it all, until I was assigned to Ward C, the abandoned wing. Ward C had been closed for years due to a budget cut, but the whispers among the staff said it was something else. Strange incidents. Equipment failing without reason, patients screaming about things they couldn't describe, and shadows that moved against the light. The administration eventually shut it down, citing renovations that never happened. But that night, the hospital was overflowing. A mass casualty accident on the highway brought in more patients than we could handle. The ICU was full, so we were forced to use the old Ward C for overflow. My job was to set up ventilators for critical patients and ensure everything was functional. When I arrived on the ward, the air was different. Colder. Staler. The smell of disinfectant lingered, but beneath it was something faintly sour, almost rancid. The fluorescents buzzed overhead, some flickering intermittently, casting strange, distorted shadows across the empty beds. I wheeled the first ventilator into room 306. The patient, an elderly woman with a traumatic chest injury, was already unconscious. Her labored breathing filled the silence. As I adjusted the settings on the machine, I felt it. An intense, oppressive pressure, like being watched from all sides. I glanced behind me. Nothing. The feeling didn't leave, though. It followed me as I moved down the hall, setting up equipment room by room. By the time I reached room 312, the hairs on my neck were standing on end. The room was empty, but I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting just beyond the door frame. I told myself it was exhaustion. Long shifts play tricks on the mind. But as I turned to leave, the door to room 312 slammed shut with a deafening bang. I froze, heart hammering, as the sound echoed through the empty corridor. Gathering my courage, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Before I could touch it, the handle turned on its own, slowly, deliberately. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, almost inaudible. "Help! Me!" It wasn't the kind of voice you'd expect from a living person. It was distant, distorted, as if it came from beneath layers of static. I backed away, bumping into a gurney. The whisper grew louder, more desperate. Help! Me! This time it was accompanied by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but before I could turn, the lights in the corridor flickered violently and then went out, plunging the entire wing into darkness. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, slow, shuffling, and deliberate, approaching from the far end of the hallway. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then, in the distance, a figure emerged. It was humanoid but wrong. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its movements were jerky, like a puppet on frayed strings. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The figure drew closer, and I saw its face, or what should have been a face. It was featureless, smooth like melted wax, and yet I felt its gaze boring into me. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into an incoherent cacophony. My chest tightened, and the flashlight slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. I scrambled to grab it, the beam now illuminating the floor. That's when I saw the trail of bloody footprints leading from room 312 to where I stood. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main hospital floor, gasping for air and startling the security guard. When I tried to explain what had happened, he just stared at me with a grim expression. "Ward C," he said. "You're not the first. That place, it's not just empty. It's angry." I refused to go back. The hospital administration moved the overflow patients out the next morning, citing power issues. But I know the truth. Ward C wasn't just abandoned. It was left behind to contain whatever lingers there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to step into its domain. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers.
Story number 5.
I used to think night shifts in the hospital were just boring and uneventful. A time to catch up on charts, sip stale coffee, and let the silence stretch between the occasional call light. That was before the elevator incident, a night that still haunts me, no matter how hard I try to forget. It was a slow shift, nearing 3 a.m., the hour when exhaustion grips the staff and the building feels impossibly quiet. I had just finished checking on a patient in the ICU when the charge nurse asked me to retrieve a blood sample from the lab on the basement level. Normally, the lab techs handle that, but they were swamped, and we were short-staffed. The hospital elevator system is old, creaky, and prone to delays. It's something we've all learned to tolerate. But that night, the delays felt deliberate. I pressed the button for the elevator, and the doors opened almost immediately. Inside, the car was empty, lit by the flickering fluorescent light above. The walls, lined with polished metal, reflected my exhausted face as I stepped in and hit the button for the basement. The doors groaned shut, and the elevator jolted to life. As it descended, the flickering light grew worse. It cast strange, stuttering shadows that danced along the walls. I leaned against the back wall, closing my eyes for a moment. But then the elevator jolted to an abrupt stop. I opened my eyes, heart skipping a beat. The panel read floor 3, but I hadn't pressed that button. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a dark, empty hallway. It was a surgical recovery ward, closed off for renovations. No lights, no movement. I leaned forward cautiously, peering into the corridor. "Hello?" My voice echoed, met only by silence. There shouldn't have been anyone there. This part of the hospital had been sealed for months. As I debated whether to step out or press the close button, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. My stomach dropped. It was a woman. Her hospital gown hanging loosely from her thin frame, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her hair was tangled, covering part of her face. She stood perfectly still, staring straight at me. "Ma'am, are you lost?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond, didn't move. The air inside the elevator grew heavy, oppressive. I reached for the button panel, but the elevator doors refused to close. My finger jabbed at the close button repeatedly, panic setting in. The woman took a step forward, her bare feet dragging against the floor, then another step and another. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if her body resisted her every motion. She raised one arm, her fingers gnarled, pointing directly at me. That's when I noticed her face. Her eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and her mouth stretched impossibly wide, as if frozen in a scream. The elevator lights flickered violently, and the panel beeped erratically. The doors suddenly slammed shut, and the car lurched downward, plunging me into complete darkness. I gripped the handrail, my breathing ragged. The air felt thick, suffocating. Then, In the darkness, I heard it. Soft, wet footsteps inside the elevator. I swung my flashlight around wildly, illuminating the small space. No one was there, but the sound didn't stop. It circled me, growing louder, closer. I pressed my back against the wall, my hands trembling as I shone the light into every corner, and then the elevator stopped again. The doors slid open to the basement, but something was wrong. The lights in the hallway flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, sour stench. I stepped out cautiously, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The lab was just down the hall, its doors slightly ajar. I quickened my pace, desperate to grab the sample and get back upstairs. But as I approached the door, I heard faint whispers coming from inside. Not here, not here, not here. The voices overlapped, dozens of them, soft and frantic. I froze in the doorway, peering inside. The room was empty, the counters lined with neatly organized vials and equipment. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, as if coming from the walls themselves. My eyes were drawn to the far corner, where a shadow stretched unnaturally long, curling up toward the ceiling. And then it moved. The shadow peeled away from the corner, solidifying into a figure. It was her, the woman from the third floor. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine as she slithered forward, her movements fluid yet wrong, like oil spreading across water. I didn't wait to see more. Dropping the flashlight, I turned and ran, the whispers rising into a deafening cacophony behind me. The elevator doors were still open, and I dove inside, slamming the button for the main floor. The doors closed just as the shadow reached the threshold, the metal groaning as if something pressed against it from the outside. The elevator shot upward, the panel blinking erratically between floors. My heart pounded as I clutched the handrail, praying for it to reach the top. When the doors finally opened to the ICU, I stumbled out, gasping for air. No one believed me when I told them. They said stress and fatigue had gotten to me. But I know what I saw. That part of the hospital wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. And now, whenever I hear the hum of the elevator during my shift, my heart skips a beat. Because I know that whatever I encountered that night is still there, lurking in the shadows, watching.
Story number 6.
Hospitals at night become an entirely different world. The brightly lit corridors that buzz with activity during the day transform into silent, eerie tunnels of flickering light. As a newly hired security guard at St. Gabriel's Hospital, I thought I had prepared myself for the night shift. I was wrong. It was my third week on the job, and I was assigned to patrol the old pediatric wing on the 4th floor. The wing had been shut down years ago, supposedly due to budget cuts, but everyone whispered about something else, something the staff didn't like to talk about. I had walked those halls before on my rounds. The empty cribs and child-sized beds, still dressed with faded cartoon sheets, gave me the creeps. But the wing was quiet, always empty, nothing out of the ordinary. Until that night. It started with a call on my radio. The nurse at the front desk reported hearing faint music coming from the 4th floor. Probably some equipment acting up, I said, trying to reassure her. I'll check it out. As I stepped off the elevator, the air felt different, heavier. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual, and a faint chill crawled up my spine. I walked down the main corridor, my flashlight scanning the empty rooms. That's when I heard it, soft, melodic notes drifting through the air. It was unmistakably a lullaby. I followed the sound, my heart pounding with each step. The music seemed to grow louder as I approached room 403. The door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of a nightlight spilling into the hall. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was empty, just a single crib in the corner, its metal frame covered in a thin layer of dust. The music box sat on the edge of the crib, spinning slowly, its melody clear and haunting. I frowned. There was no reason for it to be playing. No one had been on this floor in years. I reached out to stop it, but as my fingers brushed the metal, the music abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and the air grew colder still. Then I heard it, the faint giggle of a child. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. It echoed in the empty corridor, playful yet chilling. My pulse raced as I backed out of the room, the lullaby starting up again on its own, slower and more distorted. As I turned to head back to the elevator, I saw something move at the far end of the hallway. A small figure stood there, just out of the flashlight's reach. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The figure took a step forward, just enough for me to see. It was a little girl, no older than 6, wearing a hospital gown that hung loosely from her frame. Her hair was matted and her skin was pale, almost gray. She stared at me with wide, sunken eyes, unblinking. "Are you lost?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. She just tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. And then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent ice through my veins. Before I could react, she turned and ran down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. Her giggles echoed behind her, playful but wrong. Against every instinct in my body, I followed, my boots clanging against the tile floor. She darted into another room, the door slamming shut behind her. When I reached it, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The giggles stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the air inside was suffocatingly cold. My flashlight swept across the walls, revealing faded drawings of flowers, animals, and smiling faces. And then on the far wall, I saw it. A message scrawled in red crayon, dripping as if it were fresh. "Play with me." My stomach dropped. The door behind me slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and the room was plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and erratic. I turned toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then I felt it. A small, icy hand wrapping around my wrist. I spun around, the flashlight catching the girl's face inches from mine. Her eyes were black voids now, and her grin had stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She giggled again, a sound that was no longer human, and whispered, "Stay." I don't remember much after that. When I came to, I was sitting in the elevator. The doors opened to the ground floor. My flashlight was gone, and my wrist burned where she had touched me. The nurses found me pale and shaking, unable to explain what had happened. I quit the next day, but I've heard the stories from others. Security guards and night staff who swear they've seen her too, heard her giggles, and felt the cold touch of her hand. No one stays in that wing for long. And the music box? They say it still plays sometimes, even though it's broken, spinning its haunting lullaby for the little girl who never left.
Story number 7.
The hospital morgue was always the most dreaded part of the building. Most staff avoided it unless absolutely necessary, but as a night shift nurse, there were times I had no choice. Transporting bodies to the morgue was part of the job, though it never stopped feeling unnerving. That night, it became something far worse. The call came just after 2 a.m. A patient in room 218 had passed unexpectedly. The ICU was short-staffed, so I volunteered to handle the transfer. I fetched the body bag, wheeled the stretcher to the room, and carefully moved the patient. Mr. Delaney had been in a coma for weeks, and his passing wasn't a shock, but there was something about the stillness of his face that made my skin crawl. The hospital was eerily quiet as I made my way down to the morgue. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, some flickering sporadically. I tried not to think too much about the silence, but every sound, every creak of the stretcher's wheels, every hum of the lights felt magnified. When I reached the morgue, the large metal doors loomed before me, cold and uninviting. Swiping my ID badge, I pushed through and wheeled the stretcher to the far corner where the storage units were lined up. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying a metallic tang that made me uneasy. I began the process of tagging and logging the body. As I reached for the clipboard, I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was so soft at first, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my hand clutching the clipboard. The sound was coming from the far end of the morgue, near the older storage units. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There shouldn't have been anyone down here. The morgue was supposed to be empty, except for me. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the refrigeration units. I shook my head, chalking it up to nerves. But as I turned back to Mr. Delaney, something else caught my attention. The toe tag was missing. I blinked, certain I had just written it. I searched around the stretcher, on the floor, even under the wheels, but it was gone. My heart began to race as I stood upright, feeling a chill creep over me. And then the tapping resumed, louder and faster. It wasn't coming from the far end anymore. It was closer, behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the beam revealed nothing. The storage units stood in neat rows, their metal doors reflecting the harsh fluorescent light, but something felt wrong. I could feel it. A presence watching me. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, dragging sound. It came from the storage unit directly to my left. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The unit's door was slightly ajar. I knew it had been closed when I entered. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped forward and slowly pulled the door open. The unit was empty. No body, no sign of movement. But the air inside was colder than the rest of the room, and there was a faint, sour smell that turned my stomach. As I stepped back, I heard a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible. "Why? Did you leave me?" My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just in the room, it was right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. There, at the center of the room, stood Mr. Delaney. His hospital gown hung limply from his skeletal frame, and his face was wrong. His eyes were hollow, black voids, and his jaw hung slack, as if dislocated. His head tilted slowly to one side, and he took a step toward me. The sound of his bare feet dragging against the cold tile floor was deafening in the silence. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the storage unit behind me. "You're dead," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You're not supposed to be here." He didn't respond. Instead, his head snapped to the side with a sickening crack, and a smile stretched across his face, far wider than humanly possible. "You left me alone," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted for the door. The sound of dragging footsteps followed me, growing faster, closer. I slammed into the heavy metal doors, fumbling with my ID badge, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. When the scanner finally beeped and the door unlocked, I threw myself into the hallway and turned to shut the door. He was standing on the other side, staring at me through the small glass window. His hand reached up, pressing against the glass, leaving a bloody smear. And then he smiled again, mouthing the words, "I'll see you soon." The lights in the hallway flickered violently, and for a brief moment his face changed. It wasn't Mr. Delaney anymore. It was someone, or something, else entirely. Something monstrous. The door slammed shut on its own, and the morgue was silent once more. I didn't finish my shift that night. I went straight to my supervisor, handed over my ID badge, and walked out of the hospital, never looking back. I still don't know what I saw or why it happened, but I know one thing for certain. Some things don't stay dead, and in the quiet, forgotten corners of the hospital, they wait.
Story number 8.
There's a part of every hospital that staff whisper about, but rarely acknowledge. A floor, a wing, or a room where things just don't feel right. At St. Helena's General, that place was the isolation ward on the 6th floor. Long since closed, it was a relic of the hospital's darker past, used during the influenza outbreak decades ago. The ward had been sealed off after a fire gutted most of it, leaving behind charred walls and memories better forgotten. It was a quiet night when I first encountered it. I was a float nurse, assigned to different departments as needed. That evening, I had been sent to help the understaffed ICU on the 5th floor. My shift passed uneventfully until about 2:30 a.m., when the call lights in room 512 began flickering. The patient in 512 was an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, recovering from surgery. He was frail but lucid, and earlier in the night he'd been cheerful, even cracking jokes. But when I entered his room, I found him sitting up in bed, his face pale and drawn. "She's here," he whispered, clutching the thin blanket tightly. "Who's here, Mr. Grayson?" I asked, keeping my tone calm despite the chill that ran down my spine. "The woman in black," he replied, his voice trembling. She was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I looked around the room, my flashlight casting soft beams on the walls and furniture. There was no one there, of course. I reassured him that he was safe, attributing it to a dream or a side effect of his medication. But as I stepped out of his room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Half an hour later, the call lights in his room began to flicker again. When I returned, Mr. Grayson was even more distressed. "She wants me to follow her," he said, his voice breaking. "She says she can take me somewhere better." I tried to calm him, but as I stood by his bed, I heard it too, a faint dragging sound, like fabric being pulled across the floor. It was coming from the hallway. I stepped out, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound was faint but unmistakable, leading toward the elevator. The hallway was empty, the shadows seeming longer than they should have been under the dim emergency lighting. My heart raced as I followed the noise. The elevator doors stood open, waiting. I hesitated, staring at the panel. The button for the 6th floor, the sealed isolation ward, was glowing faintly. That floor was locked. No one could access it, or so I thought. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away. But curiosity and duty overrode fear, and I stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut behind me, and the car began to ascend on its own. The ride was slow, the air inside growing colder with each passing second. When the doors opened, I was greeted by the charred remains of the isolation ward. The smell of smoke and mildew was thick, and the faint outline of burnt hospital beds and equipment littered the hall. At first, the floor was silent. My flashlight illuminated blackened walls and debris, but nothing else. Then, from the far end of the hallway, I saw her, the woman in black. She stood motionless, her face obscured by a veil. Her dress was old-fashioned, flowing by, and seemed to shift unnaturally as if caught in a non-existent wind. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She raised one hand, pale and skeletal, and pointed directly at me. "Come," she whispered, though her lips didn't move. The sound echoed inside my head, distant and haunting. I backed away, stumbling into the elevator. As the doors closed, she began to move, floating, gliding, her feet never touching the floor. The last thing I saw before the doors sealed shut was her face as the veil lifted. It wasn't a face at all, just hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. The elevator plummeted, the lights flickering wildly. When the doors finally opened, I was back on the 5th floor, shaking and drenched in sweat. The hall was quiet, the familiar sounds of monitors and soft voices grounding me. I returned to Mr. Grayson's room, only to find it empty. His bed was neatly made, the machines turned off. Confused, I checked with the charge nurse, who informed me that Mr. Grayson had passed away minutes ago. "They found him sitting up in bed," she said. Looked peaceful, like he was waiting for someone. To this day, I don't take the elevator alone at night, and I never ever look at the button for the 6th floor, because I know that if I do, she might be waiting for me again.
Story number 9.
The hospital's basement was a labyrinth of storage rooms, maintenance corridors, and old equipment no one bothered to discard. It was the kind of place that echoed strangely, where footsteps felt too loud, and the shadows seemed to shift just out of sight. As a night shift nurse, I only ventured down there when absolutely necessary, usually to retrieve supplies. That night, I drew the short straw. The ICU had run out of portable monitors, and the only spares were stored in the basement. My coworker, Claire, joked as I grabbed the key. "If you hear a kid laughing, run," she said with a smirk. "People say the basement's haunted." I laughed it off, but her words lingered as I descended the creaking staircase. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the narrow corridor. The air grew colder as I went deeper, carrying a faint metallic tang. The storage room was at the far end of the hall, past a series of old, unused offices. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I reached for the storage room door, I heard it, a faint whisper, too soft to make out but unmistakably human. I froze, the key halfway into the lock. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls. Silence answered me. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the wind or the pipes. After all, this was an old building, and strange noises were part of the territory. Inside the storage room, I found the monitor and placed it on the cart. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, this time clearer. A child's voice, faint and playful, singing a nursery rhyme. "Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies." The cart handle slipped from my hand, the sound reverberating through the room. My blood turned cold. The voice was coming from just outside the door. I peeked into the hallway, expecting to find nothing, but there she was. A little girl, no older than 7, stood at the end of the corridor. Her hospital gown was torn and stained, her hair tangled and matted. She stared at me, unblinking, her face eerily pale in the flickering light. "Are you lost?" I managed to ask, though my throat felt dry. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head and smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide. Before I could move, she turned and ran, disappearing into one of the old offices. Against every ounce of better judgment, I followed. My flashlight beam shook as I stepped into the room. It was empty, save for a few old desks and filing cabinets. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of decay lingered. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the light from my flashlight dimmed as the battery drained unnaturally fast. I could hear the nursery rhyme again, but it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was all around me, Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The words twisted and echoed, distorted into something guttural and malevolent. I backed against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, growing taller and darker until it consumed the light. And then she appeared again, standing inches from me. Her face was wrong now. Her eyes black pits, her mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. She reached out a hand, her fingernails long and cracked. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice like shards of glass. I screamed, slamming my shoulder against the door. On the third attempt, it flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The corridor was empty, the lights steady once more. I abandoned the cart and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the ICU, Claire took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, but I couldn't find the words. I later learned the basement offices had been used as a makeshift pediatric ward decades ago, during a flu outbreak that overwhelmed the hospital. Many of the children didn't survive, and the ward was eventually shut down. I never went back to the basement. But sometimes late at night I hear faint giggles echoing from the stairwell, and the melody of that nursery rhyme drifts through the ICU like a warning. Ring around the rosy.
Story number 10.
The hospital janitor, Mr. Hartman, had been working the night shift for decades. He wasn't much of a talker, but he had a peculiar habit. Every so often he'd walk into the ICU with a mop and bucket, glance at the clock and mutter, "Time to clean room 303. There was just one problem. Room 303 didn't exist. The ICU ended at room 302. Beyond that was just a blank wall with no sign of a door ever being there. The first time I saw him do it, I thought he was joking. But his face was deadly serious, his movements mechanical, almost trance-like. The older nurses told me to leave him alone. "It's just something he does," one of them said. "Don't ask questions." One night, curiosity got the better of me. It was 3 a.m., and the floor was unusually quiet. Mr. Hartman walked in with his bucket, muttering his usual, "Time to clean room 303, and headed straight toward the wall at the end of the corridor. I followed at a distance, watching as he stopped in front of the blank wall. He stood there for a moment unmoving, and then raised his hand as if he were knocking on an invisible door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The sound echoed, though there shouldn't have been anything for it to resonate against. To my astonishment, the wall shimmered like ripples on the surface of water, and then it opened. A door materialized, old and wooden, its paint peeling. Beyond it was a dark, narrow room filled with the unmistakable stench of decay. Mr. Hartman stepped inside and the door began to close behind him. "Wait," I called out, my voice trembling. He paused, turning his head slightly to look at me. His eyes were distant, as if he were somewhere far away. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "She doesn't like visitors." Before I could respond, the door slammed shut. I rushed forward, my hand reaching for the knob, but it was gone. The wall was solid again, as if the door had never existed. I stood there, my heart pounding, the faint scent of rot lingering in the air. For a moment, I considered telling someone, but who would believe me? Instead, I returned to the nurse's station, shaken but determined to stay quiet. Half an hour later, Mr. Hartman reappeared, pushing his mop and bucket down the hall as if nothing had happened. I watched him closely, looking for any sign of what he'd just done, but he seemed perfectly normal. The next morning, I couldn't help myself. I did some digging. I found an old floor plan of the hospital from the 1970s, and there it was, room 303. It had been sealed off after a patient, a young woman named Evelyn, had been found dead inside under mysterious circumstances. The details were vague, but the report mentioned strange occurrences in the room, flickering lights, whispers, objects moving on their own. After Evelyn's death, the room was boarded up, and eventually the hospital remodeled to erase its existence entirely. But something of her remained. That was years ago, and I've long since left that hospital. But every now and then I think about Mr. Hartman and his strange ritual. I wonder what he saw in room 303, what compelled him to return night after night, and I wonder who was waiting for him on the other side.